Shalom Aleichem, Moshe Taragin from the Gush. Honored to talk about Parshas Bechukotai, Behar-Bechukotai this week, for the OU, the Orthodox Union's All Parsha video series. We don't know much about history and Mashiach, Galus and Geula. It is intentionally suppressed for many reasons. Chazal had a disinclination already stemming from Yaakov and Daniel's attempts that were thwarted from above to decode or to provide a roadmap. But there are hints and dropped here and there, and there's so much about Jewish history that can be seen and read between the lines in Parshas Bechukotai, because a Torah is not just a random punishment from Hashem, it's Galus, as the Ramban famously says. There are two Torahs. The first one correlates to the first Galus. The second, in Kitavo, correlates to the second Galus. And there is your first hidden message. There are only two Galuses. There will not be a third Galus. V'chahena. There are many, many important Rambans, important Rashis, important Midrashim about Jewish history, about the Ark of Redemption, ARC, the trajectory of history. I want to talk about one pasuk, one iconic pasuk in the end of Parshas Bechukotai, which hints at Geula. But before that pasuk, I want to talk a little bit about a revolution in Tanakh study and why it's relevant to reading this pasuk. In Eretz Yisrael in particular, there's been a renewed interest in Tanakh. Tanakh was something which was neglected and abandoned for hundreds of years for all sorts of reasons. The Netziv had a big chiddush. He gave a daily Parshas HaShavua shir in Volozhin. Big chiddush. You could actually teach Parshas HaShavua. Thank God, because it became the Hamikdavar, which I just gave shir on today. It's an amazing sefer, especially the new edition with the footnotes. It makes a world of a difference. Highly recommended. But in any event, there's been a renewed interest in Tanakh learning, primarily in Eretz Yisrael. The return to the land of history has sparked renewed interest in the book of history. But not only are people studying Tanakh more avidly, and I'm sure there's an OU All Tanakh program or shiurim available, I'm certain of it, but the style in which people are studying Tanakh is radically different than some of the ways we've been reading Pesukim in Tanakh over the past couple hundred years. Chazal, by and large, were deconstructionists. Deconstructing a text, which is not just limited, of course, to Torah text, means you break down large bodies of text, chapters into small sentences, sentences into words, words into vowels, and you try to tweak meaning from small little atomic pieces. And this is not just true. I apologize, but we are having, because it's so hot in Eretz Yisrael, we're having a lot of electricity issues on and off. So I just have to continue this video series. It's a little bit darker, so it's a little bit of a spooky feel. But I have to go give shir in a few minutes, so I don't really have so much time to record today. So this is the window that I have to give shir in. Hopefully the lights will be restored soon. But Torah has learned kiner mitzvah v'Torah or, so even it's a little darker. Hopefully you can hear me and still see me. Anyway, getting back to, and that's not just true of Torah text. I studied literature, and in some of my literature courses we studied Derrida and some others, and they were deconstructionists, and they assumed, which I'm not sure I agree with, that Shakespeare was so expert at creating meaning that he didn't just create meaning by the narratives, but by the words he chose and the wordplay. True or not true, it doesn't make a difference. L'havdil Chazal saw the Sefer of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Torah, as a text that's meant to be deconstructed. The extra vav, the double language, the double word, the gzera shava, the extra hodai lav chatasa, whatever you're learning, and that tone of breaking down Pesukim into codes and letters and double words, the lights are trying to get back on, so maybe a little bit shiny, but it's all right. And that informed the way a lot, not all, but the way a lot of Mefarshei Tanakh, Mefarshei Torah, treated the Torah. Rashi in particular. Rashi's taken more or less from Midrashim. He does provide Pasha Pshat, but more or less, what does this word mean, and what does it refer to, what's the gematria, and of course, this is the work of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is capable of writing text, in this case, his will, the Torah and Tanakh, in ways that We can't even imagine writing, so everything is a word and a code. But for some reason, meta-analysis, reading the entire parak at once, and what are the takeaways from the parak, or reading entire svarim in Tanakh, and comparing Parshas Mishpatim and the discussion of Eved Ivri and Parshas Mishpatim to the discussion of Eved Ivri later on in Sefer Devarim, that became less either popular or less apparent. It was performed, it's less apparent. Some still did. Our Babanel, of course, reads it that way. To a degree, the Ramban does, the Netziv does, but it became less popular, and that's more of a literal way of reading. When you read a text, you don't break it down to words. What does this word mean? What does that word mean? You don't cross-link words to one another. You read what the sentence says, you read what the chapter says, the more literal reading. So there's been a renewed interest in that, and it does cause some people to be unnerved, for good reason, because there is no Masorah for this. And a lot of people feel that the words of the Torah are so transcendent and eternal and celestial that we have to follow the ikve hatzon and only read the way it was read before. A lesser, more practical concern is that sometimes when the pshat and the drash, or the deconstruction, which is drash, breaking things down into letters, clashes with the pshat, people will use the pshat as a leverage to hold suspicion or question the literary integrity of how Chazal interpreted, not realizing that Chazal had a Masorah, and this is what Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu Har Sinai. It may not be literal, but that's what drash is, and that's what a halachic drash is, that's what a moral drash is. But there are some people who, either by commission or omission, namely either they're actively employing literary readings to subvert the authority of Chazal, Chas v'shalom, or by omission, they're just spending so much time learning texts and the literal reading that they don't spend enough time reading what the Gemara says, what the Midrashim say, what the Ramban said, what the Arachaim said. So there are legitimate concerns. Obviously, all those concerns can be addressed and should be addressed. And certainly in the world that I live in, and I'm not a big Tanakh teacher, but I give shiur in this style often, primarily in Shir HaShirim, which is the sefer I love. But another advantage of reading the literal pshat is you're able to see Pesukim as organic and dynamic, and as Pesukim that change as centuries evolve. And we believe that that's part of a pasuk that is prophetic, that it can mean one thing 800 years ago and another thing now, or one thing 1500 years ago. It certainly means different meanings, just at the literal level. If the pasuk in Yeshaya talks about oxes and goats, and we don't really live with oxes and goats, but we try to see them as metaphors, and we extrapolate those meanings to our current day oxes and goats, whatever they are. Edom isn't around anymore. Edom probably is, but Ammon and Moab aren't around anymore. So when the Navi rails against Ammon and Moab, we try to identify nations and cultures that are playing similar roles in our world. And I want to discuss one such pasuk in the end of Bechukotai, and two ways in which the pasuk has generated, or not generated, but accrued different meaning in the 21st century, in Tafshin Pei. And when you say the pasuk, it's not just a pasuk in Bechukotai, it's an iconic pasuk. It's a pasuk we recite in Slichot, it's a pasuk we recite in Tfilas Rosh Hashanah. V'zacharti es brisi Yaakov, v'af es brisi Yitzchak, v'af es brisi Avraham ezkor, v'haaretz ezkor. Who doesn't know that pasuk? And it's a pasuk that figures in the registry of Psukei Zichron, it's not Malchios, excuse me. And it's a pasuk which, in a general sense, is Hashem promising that even though we betrayed him, and were expelled from Eretz Yisrael, he will not forget the bris. He will invoke the bris, the triplicate bris, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, just as a Maramakom I gave a shiur today on the Netziv, delineating different components of the bris that were delivered to Yaakov, Yitzchak, and Avram in that order, because that's the sequence of the Pesukim, so you can find that on Torah, but this is not about that Netziv. What it is about is two things. Number one, if you look carefully at the Pesukim, when the HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises to remember the bris of Avraham, and promises to remember the bris of Yaakov, and promises to remember the bris haaretz, and we'll talk about that bris haaretz later. Light's trying to get on. Again, I apologize. It's going to flash a little bit. When Hashem makes those promises, the verb lizkor is applied. V'zacharti es brisi Yaakov. V'af es brisi Avraham ezkor. V'haaretz ezkor. So the term eskar means that figuratively, the way we would imagine, if I asked you to remember something from my past, you would jog your memory, you'd scratch your head, yeah, I remember what you told me, I remember that. So being that we want to imagine a Kadosh Baruch Hu in anthropomorphic terms, we're allowed to make him feel closer and more accessible to us. So he remembers the bris of Avram, and he remembers the bris of Yaakov, and he remembers the bris Aretz, even though his remembering is so different from ours. At least the imaginative, anthropomorphic, simulated activity is associated. But when HaKadosh Baruch Hu accesses the bris of Yitzchak, the word Zechira doesn't appear, it's omitted. So I'll repeat the pasuk again so you can hear the omission, and I'll pause at the right place. Ve'zacharti es brisi Yaakov, ve'af es brisi Yitzchak, ve'af es brisi Avraham es zikor, ve'haaretz ezkor. Yitzchak's memory doesn't carry zikaron with it. So I'll actually quote the Rashi, which is a drasha, it is deconstructionist, so it's not really in line with the new style of learning Tanakh, but it is in line with trying to modernize Pesukim and make them more relevant both in our minds and in our hearts when we daven. Rashi comments, based on the Medrash, that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu recalls Avram and Yaakov, he has to remember, again in our terms. But when HaKadosh Baruch Hu recalls the bris of Yitzchak, he doesn't have to remember. It's too palpable. It's too immediate because Hashem looks down from his Kisei HaKavod in Shamayim, right down at Har HaMoriah, which is Hadom Raglav, which is effectively his Adamin, his footrest, or his footprints in this earth. Again, all metaphors and expressions. And he sees the ashes of Yitzchak, tzavur, heaped up, Tzadik Beis Vav Reish, tzavur, al Gav HaMizbeach. And those ashes, and the heroism of those ashes, are so compelling that Hashem doesn't have to remember and access. It's just right there, and Hashem answers and invokes the bris. And of course, Yitzchak wasn't slaughtered. Yitzchak did not produce ashes. He lived a long life, and he died an old man. But his willingness to be sacrificed, and his willingness to have his body be rendered to ashes on behalf of Hashem's command, is seen by Hashem as if it had occurred. Because Hashem intervened, Al natishach yadcha lanar, v'ata'as lamuma. So I'm thinking about this pasuk, and we say it every year during davening, and we read it during Behar-Bechukotai, and we say it in Slichos, and in the Zechar Chamecha right before Shema Koleinu. So it's both Slichos and Tfilas Rosh Hashanah. So I'll put the lights on now. Some of the lights aren't going on, but I'll take a second. So I apologize about the lighting difference. But I'm reading that pasuk. Okay, so we should have some lights now. I apologize. Okay, back to a lit room. Kiner mitzvah v'torah or Torah. And I'm thinking to myself, I heard this from Rav Amital, if the ashes of one person who wasn't burnt, and they're not real ashes, they're virtual ashes, can be so compelling to Hashem that he has to answer our tfilos and remember the bris without any memory jogging, what about the ashes of 6 million Jews scattered amongst the killing fields of Europe who were not Zocha to Kavura, who actually were burnt al Kiddush Hashem because they were Jewish? And of course, Rav Amital didn't live through this, but so much of what he lived through was almost a blueprint, sadly, for some of the things we're living through. What about the ashes of October 7th, the people who just wanted to defend our land and live in our land and be in our land and be close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, whether consciously or subconsciously? And the point is, that meaning to the pasuk never really existed. In no way downplaying or trivializing past Jewish suffering. But the degree of hatred that Jewish bodies weren't just murdered, massacred, defiled, vandalized, whatever happened, but huge numbers of Jews, again, not to compare the Holocaust to October 7th, but you feel structurally the same hatred expressing itself. It's not enough for us to just murder, but to eliminate any trace of that Jew, because the mere mention, the mere picture of a Bibas child is just so offensive to me that I'll tear it down. How? That's such, who doesn't like a child? So innocent looking. Supposedly there's still 250 or 350 bags of human ash that had been collected from October 7th that many people fear will never be properly identified. So when you say that pasuk, especially during davening, you have to say it differently. The pasuk has new meaning. And I think HaKadosh Baruch Hu wrote that pasuk, and wrote, in this case, the pasuk without the Zechira by Yitzchak, leading to the Medrash, to allow this meaning to amplify in ways that were far beyond the meaning that the original Medrash that Rashi quotes suggests. So you have to be willing to see Pesukim. I don't want to say see Pesukim is prophecy, that's scary. But see Pesukim is living organisms, because they're part of Jewish history, and to be able to attach them to events in Jewish history, and of course both tragic events and triumphant events. And the second part of this pasuk is the end of the pasuk. The end of the pasuk says, "V'zachartis brisi Yaakov, v'yavis brisi Yitzchak, v'yavis brisi Avram ezkor, v'haaretz ezkor." What is the haaretz ezkor? What's the, in more or less, the bris haaretz? The word bris doesn't appear, but it's latent in the pasuk. Brisi Yaakov, brisi Yitzchak, brisi Avram, haaretz ezkor. So there's a bris haaretz. What does that mean? Well, you have to know the context. This pasuk could not have been said in Parsha Shmos. In Parsha Shmos, all we had was a bris avos, because we never lived in Israel. And Hashem remembers the bris avos, and that famous pasuk, Shema Hashem Snakasam Iskaras Briso. But there's a question that's raised, and it's a haunting question that echoes eerily through Jewish history. What about Jews who will abandon, maybe through no fault of their own, maybe history has beaten it out of them, maybe Tino Shenishba, maybe because they rebel, whatever. But they abandon the lifestyle of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, whatever that lifestyle means, ritual, mitzvos, Torah, chesed, whatever. How will they still be included in Jewish destiny and the return from Galus? And not just the geographic return, but the historical redemption. And Parshas Behar-Bechukotai provides the answer. There's a separate bris. And that's the bris haaretz, people who lived in Israel, which can only be stated in Bechukotai, not before, because Bechukotai is speaking to people who had already lived in Israel, were expelled in Galus, and then Hashem returns them because they have the merit of commitment to land, peoplehood, and history. Land, peoplehood, and Jewish history, both past Jewish history and future Jewish destiny. That's a separate bris. Now we all are trying to fuse those two brisos, the bris of Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Torah, mitzvos, chesed, midos, and the bris of historical consciousness. But Hashem created a separate track for Jews who cannot and will not at this stage, one day they will, participate in the bris of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, but they're deeply, deeply engaged in the bris haaretz. And it gives you a whole new lens by which to view, and I've talked about this so many times, I'm sure you heard me vocalize it in other contexts and through other metaphors. But when you see Jews who are no longer directly engaged in the bris of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, ask yourself, well, are they hanging on to Jewish identity, and by extension to Jewish destiny, because they're so deeply engaged and committed to bris haaretz? So I have to go give shir now. Wait for no one. Hopefully there's electricity in my shir room. But two deeply iconic meanings drawn from this pasuk. Number one, that the virtual ashes of Yitzchak compel Hashem to answer our tefillos effectively. What about the actual ones? And not just of one person. And second of all, keep in mind that this pasuk is establishing a separate bris haaretz, which retains Jewish inclusion and participation in Jewish destiny for those for whom the bris of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov no longer resonates. Shabbat Shalom.